the COVID-19 crisis, using data and evidence to understand the impact of the pandemic and to build a better future for higher education in Sub-Saharan Africa. Having gone through the pandemic period, there were lessons that we were picking, and there were studies that we were doing, and we felt that now looking beyond, we needed to look at the data that we were generating and facilitate some engagements to see how we can build a better future for higher education. We agreed to host a number of webinars, the 5 webinars under the PASGR Plus platform. This is an innovative learning and social platform that brings together like-minded stakeholders in the evidence policy ecosystem to share and network around policy issues of interest. PASGR Plus stands for people, learning, understanding, and sharing. The webinars are therefore jointly delivered by the 2 organizations, and we are using this platform to share lessons that we learned from our recent studies around COVID-19 pandemic and programmatic interventions and stakeholder engagements. And by bringing together and fostering discussions among policymakers, educators, students, funders, and other stakeholders, we are using the emerging evidence, which we hope to advance policy uptake of the evidence that is coming out of our work. The series kicked off sometimes in September, that was on 15th of September. And we focused our first webinar around quality assuring online teaching and learning in higher education institutions. I acknowledge and appreciate the interest that this generated. This was a well-attended webinar. We had 158 participants, and they came from far and wide. We had representatives from 23 countries. Most of them were from Africa, but we also had participants coming from outside Africa, countries like Germany, the United States, the UK, and we were very delighted to have your engagement. We acknowledge those who are coming back to us a second time because we see a lot of interest in this. So today's webinar will focus on achieving equitable access to higher education post-COVID pandemic, post-COVID-19 pandemic. We will focus on some of the work that PASGR has done recently on a research that has focused on strengthening equitable access to higher education during and post-COVID-19 pandemic. This will be followed by a panel discussion with invited higher education experts that are drawn from the academia, regional research body, as well as a representative from a university outside Africa to provide a global North perspective. At this point, I would like to acknowledge the generous support from our funder, the Carnegie Corporation of New York, that supported us to carry out the research. Before I end my remarks, allow me to briefly introduce the Partnership for African Social and Governance Research for the benefit of those who are joining us for the first time. PASGR, in short, is a Pan-African not-for-profit making organization that is based in Nairobi with a footprint in 26 African countries. Our mission is to enhance research excellence in governance and public policy that contributes to the overall well-being of citizens. We do this in partnership with individual academics and researchers, higher education institutions, research think tanks, the civil society, as well as business and policy communities, both in the region and internationally. We have 3 anchor programs. The first one being the research and policy program that produces evidence and facilitates policy uptake. Then we have the professional development and training program that tools and retool early and mid-career African researchers. And then we have the higher education program that facilitates collaborative postgraduate programs. And currently we have a program, a master's program called Master of Research and Public Policy, collaboratively delivered by 14 universities in 8 African countries. And then we have a doctoral program in public policy that is delivered by 3 universities. We also have a pedagogical program, which I believe some of you may be aware of. It's called PEDO, short for Pedagogical Leadership in Africa. Our co-host executive director, Dr. Lucy Hedy, will briefly introduce ESSA later on during her closing remarks. So I would like to end here and wish you an insightful and engaging time. So at this point, I would like to welcome our Professor Stephen Odebero. A little bit about Prof is that he's a professor of educational planning in the Department of Education Planning and Management at Masinde Muliro University of Science and Technology, which is based in Kenya. He is the founding Deputy Principal Administration, Finance and Planning at Turkana University College, again in Kenya, and founding director of the School of Open and Distance Learning at Masinde Muliro University of Science and Technology. Prof holds a PhD in educational planning and a master's in education planning and economics of education, and specializes in higher education financing. He has over 15 years of experience as professor and researcher in many universities, locally and internationally. He has also authored over 70 scholarly works of international standing. So Prof, I give you the mic. We are excited to have you and we look forward to hearing what is coming out of our study. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let me start by appreciating PASGR for selecting the team that you're seeing to be able to undertake this study on achieving equitable access to quality higher education post-COVID-19 pandemic. The authors of this document are shown, myself, Steve, Elizabeth, Kellen, and Timothy. I will take a short time because I am timed. Just a brief background that, like all other sectors, the higher education sector in Kenya was disrupted by COVID-19 pandemic. The traditional face-to-face teaching and learning was not feasible, and for this reason, physical learning that entails the use of face-to-face interaction of learners and lecturers was therefore halted. We have what we call the Commission for University Education, which regulates the universities in Kenya. It responded by encouraging higher education institutions to shift to virtual teaching and learning through online modes. And the Kenyan universities, like most other developing countries, adopted virtual learning therefore, but this was drastic and it was a deviation from the norm. Only a few universities before the COVID-19 pandemic were already offering open distance and e-learning. The statement of the problem is COVID-19 being a relatively new experience, research evidence was needed to show how universities experienced these disruptions and what interventions were put in place that could effectively lead to achieving equitable access to university education. And so the overall aim shown is related to that. But briefly, just look at the materials and methods. I'll mention a few areas on how we carried out this study. This was a sequential research design that was employed using two distinct phases. The quantitative that was followed by the quantitative phase. Quantitative data was first collected from students, lecturers through section surveys, online and physical questionnaires, and thereafter qualitative data was followed through focus group discussions, and some of the institutions that were targeted were Kenneth, HELB is the Higher Education Loans Board, CUE is the Commission for University Education, among others. And this design was a combination of a follow-up and a participant approach. And we say we used this because it allowed for translation of emerging findings and generalization that was rich in context. The population and sample, the study population was 74 public and private universities These are the universities in Kenya according to the Commission for University Education. And from there, 34 universities were sampled. University student population is about 501 and 62. That means undergraduate and postgraduate, of which we sample out 1,220. The lecturers are about 15,064, and the sample was 273. So the general findings, as you can see, is that we had about 787 undergraduates that responded, and 157, if you look here, 157 postgraduates that responded. By type of university, you see, we also had a few constant colleges, public chartered and all that, and the percentages are shown. The implication is that majority of respondents were from public chartered universities. This is accounted for around 81%, while the private chartered universities accounted for about 12%, and then colleges just 7%. It is raining heavily in Kakamega, and I'm in the library, some students may be talking, so just don't mind. So when you look at equity in access to tuition fees, you then find that the study shows the sources of fees as follows. Sponsors, 37%. Government, just about 234%. 234, which accounts for around 23%. Guardians, just around 9%, and then 7 respondents. Then parents are the majority. So that means access to university education is a function of majorly parents, and government accounts for very little, just at around 20%. So when you look at the implication, equity in access to quality learning during the COVID-19, we have cited somebody here who says, during the height of COVID-19, several stakeholders engagements were held on how to facilitate continuity of learning in higher education institutions in respect to COVID-19 protocol. There was a consensus to ensure continuity of learning virtually, and the Ministry of Education gave policy directive. However, quality appraisal strategies on implementation was with through Q that was to ensure putting in place ICT infrastructure and capacity build students and staff facilitate teaching and learning. In other words, whereas the ministry was putting in place directive that open and distance e-learning be used, but the quality appraisal strategy was supposed to be through the regulator, who is the Commission for University Education. But this regulator faced challenges because they had never before ensured that they implement any policy using online means. They just used to use face-to-face means. Session attendance by students, session attendance by type of university. This one just was meant to show how the students were able to attend to their sessions during the time for COVID-19. And those who attended all the sessions in constant colleges are just about 3, private chartered about 22, public chartered 61. And the grand total was about 86, which amounts to 9%. So that simply means that during the height of COVID-19, only 9% of the students in both public and private universities were able to attend to all sessions. If I can say a little more, those who attended more than half were around 21%. Those who never attended anything at all, nothing, they just never got anything, are about 11%. So when you look at this, it means that if you look at the law as it is, the rules and regulations governing university examinations, is that at the height of COVID-19, if we followed the law to the letter, then only 9% of the students were eligible to sit exams. Then access to the required gadgets for online teaching, over 75% applicants for help are vulnerable and require about 3.1 billion shillings. This means that majority of applicants could not afford laptops and smartphones. This is a statement which we got through focus group discussions and also through team form and interview, particularly with the Higher Education Loans Board. And here we are recommending that Higher Education Loans Board financing of university education should build a capacity to be able to finance laptops, smartphones, and bundles to support online teaching and learning. Then I'm getting difficulty being able to see everything on top. The table here, because of some writings on top or what is coming out like participants, video, chat and question and answer is making it difficult for me to be able to access what is on top. But generally, if you look at equity in access to digital information, from one key informant interviews, it was observed that working modalities and processes changed drastically to online and teaching and learning. And it's therefore recommended that since transition to e-learning was hindered by the digital divide, vulnerable students should be, they rather failed to realize the full potential in e-learning. And it's recommended that construction of information centers across the whole country be put in place so that those who are vulnerable are able to access e-learning through those information centers. There is need for investment in upgrading of e-resources at the university so that most of our students are also able to access e-learning. Then who owns the devices in the universities among the students? You can see that those who have bought these gadgets and therefore they self-own them are just about 666. Through family, you can see that we have about 97. I want you to be able to see the percentages, and when you follow the percentages, you'll then be able to see that 75% of the gadgets are self-owned, but families also accounted for some of the gadgets that the students were able to use, and others relied on friends. Then regarding access to internet bundles, you find that situations where bundles were supplied by universities through telecom and KNET and so forth is just about 11%. Home Wi-Fi is around 14%. Personal bundles is about 40%. So it looks like personal bundles came in majorly to support online teaching and learning. So what do we recommend about bundles? The study recommends that university management be compelled to provide resources to students and to partner with cellular operators to provide education discount for internet bundles, especially if we have another pandemic like this one. And then card submission, those who submitted their cards through emails were about 50%. That's emails and WhatsApp groups. Physical were about 9%, hard copies 10%. It means during the pandemic, actually people feared coming to the university. And only 9% were able to come to submit the cards physically. Majority of them just using WhatsApp and emails, over 50%. But those who were able to use the learning management system like Odell and so forth were only 31%. So student perception of instructor adoption to online teaching and learning. It turns out here that those who are fully dissatisfied with the way lecturers now turn to online teaching and learning were about 6%. Those who are just dissatisfied were 15%, neutral for 2%, satisfied only 28%. It means that if you look at dissatisfaction at 15% and then fully dissatisfied 6%, that counts about 21%, then neutral about for 2%, either not going whichever side. And only about 28% being satisfied and 9% being fully dissatisfied. Fully satisfied, then it means that the levels of dissatisfaction in this case are much higher with the way the instructors who are the lecturers were able to adapt to online teaching and learning. Then when you look at the effectiveness, the way they are rating effectiveness of online teaching and learning, face-to-face is rated at 50%. That means majority of them prefer face-to-face. Then I'm trying to see this other one, which is fully online. Sorry, it has gone. Yes, fully online. Those who find fully online being effective are only 16%. then it simply means that we have a long way to go if we have to have the learners fully accept that fully online mode of teaching and learning is acceptable to them. And when it comes to blended learning, that means online versus face-to-face, about at 4% are for it. So in conclusion and recommendation, some of these we have already mentioned, but I'll just mention a few here. The Commission for University Education, CUE, already encouraged higher education institutions to shift to virtual teaching and learning through online modes due to COVID. This needs to be institutionalized in post-COVID through firm policy directives. Only a few universities offered open distance and e-learning ODEL before, and therefore there is need for all universities to create ODEL directorates to manage online teaching and learning. Majority of respondents were from public chartered universities, that is at 1%, while in the private chartered and other constant colleges accounted only 12% and 7% respectively. Hence, for equitable access to university education, public financing to higher education will continue to put pressure on the exchequer. And this conclusion is very important because those of you who have followed the issues around financing of university education in Kenya, the Cabinet Secretary is on record saying that they want universities not to be funded by government. Government is moving away from financing universities, and they want universities to find their own way of paying salaries and even materials and financing themselves wholly. And this is likely to be the way to go in Kenya, although not immediately, but it was already pronounced by the Cabinet Secretary. So that simply means that if that was to be the case, then majority of our learners will surely have a problem, because here we have indicated that universities must find ways of equitably financing education by ensuring that those who are needy of the bundles, those who are needy of the gadgets, laptops, phones, and so forth, be assisted. I don't know how the government, if it's not able to pay salaries now, how it's now going to move into the issues of the gadgets that are used for online teaching and learning. But it looks like this is one thing that stakeholders must come in to push. I'm emphasizing because it is important if we have to achieve equity. Then we're also recommending that higher education loans board financing, who finances the poor, they should not only pay fees, they should also look at things like laptops, smartphones, and the bundles. Because if this is the mode of teaching and learning and you have paid fees only, then it means they're losing out a lot even on research and even doing assignments. Further recommendations that there's need for public-owned places where students can access quality online bundles or quality online studies. Because of low rating for instructors in regard to adapting from the traditional face-to-face pedagogy to online teaching and learning, there is need for courses to be mounted for both students and staff on online teaching and learning. This should come as a mandatory policy, and thereafter instructors and students be required to attend such courses. You see, this thing of assuming that the instructors know how to teach online, I don't think it's going to help. We should just have courses. Also assuming that learners, as they come in at first year, they already know how to use the online mode, is also a face, is also an abuse of the whole process. And so we just need that some courses be mounted so that they can be assisted to really know how to access some of these things online. Then UN definition of the right to education to include online connectivity through Wi-Fi, access to bundles, and access to computer gadgets. Somehow people have a lot of faith in the UN, United Nations. Maybe when the United Nations comes in and it redefines the right to education to include online connectivity through Wi-Fi, access to bundles, and access to computers, access to laptops and tablets, that is when people will see that this thing has moved to a higher level. It has moved to another level, so that people then be saying, if you are not providing these gadgets, then you are not effectively supporting children to access education. I think that was my last recommendation that can ensure equity in access to education post-COVID. Thank you so much for listening to me. I hope I'm not taking a lot of time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Deborah. Thank you. That was really insightful. I will hand over now to Colleen ESSA, who will introduce the panel, and then we'll get into our discussion for the webinar.
Sure, thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor, for your very interesting presentation. Lots of elements there that I'm sure will feed into the question and answer session when we get to that stage. But for now, I'm Pauline ESSA, as introduced. I'm the Director of Research and Insight at Education Sub Saharan Africa. And it's my pleasure to engage with a number of prestigious researchers, both within and outside Africa, to delve into sort of a discussion about this whole topic of equitable access to higher education in Sub-Saharan Africa. So we'll expand the discussion with this panel and then move into a Q&A session where we'll re-invite Professor Stephen to join the three panelists, and then we can take questions and answers from the audience. So can I please encourage those who are listening, as well as the other panelists, as we go into the discussion, if you have any questions or contributions, please feel free to add them to the Q&A session or the chat, and we'll get to those in due course. But for now, I'd like to introduce our three panelists for today. So I've got Dr. Clara Araba Mills from the University of Cape Coast. She's a lecturer at the Institute for Educational Planning and Administration, that's IEPA. And that's a UNESCO Category 2 Center of Excellence at the University of Cape Coast. So Clara is an educational planner and has expertise in curriculum design and development in education. So she does postgraduate teaching and research, supervises students, but also has been involved in a number of research projects, including with the Center for Development, for Global Development, CGD, as well as doing some collaborative work with us at here at ESSA, focusing on the COVID, impact of COVID on university. So Araba is our first panelist. And then I'd also like to welcome Chris Shetty to the panel session today. He's a research manager at the Inclusive Economic Development Division of the Human Sciences Research Council in South Africa. He has a master's degree in knowledge and information management from University of Stellenbosch, and is currently a PhD candidate with Nelson Mandela University, focusing on computing in the computing science department. So his research really focuses on social applications of innovative technologies that contribute to alleviating poverty and addressing inequality and unemployment. So it's really pertinent to the topic we're discussing today. But also, yeah, his work generally spans knowledge management and digital inclusion. He has previously also worked on BRICS research at the HSRC. And so his contribution today will cover both South Africa as well as the BRICS. So we're excited to hear that aspect of his research. And then the third, but definitely not the least of our panelists today, is Professor Tristan McCowan, who is from the International Education Institute at University College of London. So he's based in the UK, but his work focuses on higher education and international development, especially in Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa. So he is interested in issues of access, quality, innovation, and sustainability. So again, very relevant to the topic for discussion today. He's also produced a book, which was published in 2019, and that looks at higher education for and beyond the Sustainable Development Goals. And he covers the years 2015 through to 2021. He also used to be the editor of Compare, which is a journal of international and comparative education. So he's currently also leading a multi-country GCRF project titled Transforming Universities for a Changing Climate. So you'll agree with me that we have quite an esteemed panel today, and we're going to have an interactive discussion based on the title of this particular webinar. Clara, are you able to turn your camera on, please, so at least the audience can see who you are? Thank you. And then we can start off. Okay, so while Clara is turning on her camera, thank you. And thank you all three for agreeing to be part of this discussion. So I guess as an opener, I mean, it would be interesting to hear from you. I'll start with Clara and then move on to Trish and then Tristan. Just from your perspective, why you think equitable access to higher education is important, and what that means to you in terms of your research. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Issa, and thank you for the organizers of the program, and thank you for the presenter as well. So with the issue of why I think equitable access to quality higher education matters in Africa, has to do with the whole essence of what equity is and the ultimate aim. The ultimate aim of equity is for one to be positioned to be represented when it comes to decision-making and access to social resource. Now we find ourselves in a continent where the population between the genders, that is male and female, they are equal. They are all 50-50. However, we have the females being highly underrepresented when it comes to tertiary education. So this culminates in having fewer women who are involved at the tertiary level, as well as even at the management positions. There was a study that was conducted by Georgina Odro and her colleagues in 2021. And they indicated that in as much as if we take the context of Ghana, the female population is 52%, yet females within the field of research and academia constitute between 20 to 25%. This means that females are highly underrepresented. So the implication that it has for the individual and for the nation, especially for the nation, that is where my concern is. It indicates that we just allow a lot of people to go waste. The nation fails to tap from the potentials or develop potentials of individuals. And that takes me to question how we even picture individuals. Do we see some people as having potentials and some people as not having anything to offer? Thus, we just look on to for them to go waste. So when we talk of equity, sometimes the advocacy approach it as if, or the interpretation given is as if we females want to push out the men, but it's supposed to be more of opening up the system so that no one will be left out. We should employ more of an inclusive system where everyone who has reason to access education will not be barred from education based on cultural limitations or financial limitations. So the society actually stands more chance or more opportunity for economic and social growth if the space is opened up for all to access higher education. That's my take on the topic.
Thank you, Clara. You've touched on the gender element straight up, and I've noted that I'm sure there are other elements of inclusion in terms of the population that will come up as we go through the discussion. But yeah, Trish, it'll be interesting to hear what response you have to the question. Thank you.
Yes, sure. Thank you, Chair, and thank you, everyone. Thank you for the invitation. It's my great honor to be part of this esteemed panel. If I think about my background and what I've been working on for the past 2 years since COVID has hit, we've written a few papers that have looked at the experiences in BRICS countries, and we've also looked at the experiences across a few countries on the continent. And when you compare the BRICS, for instance, what you are seeing is a divergence between those countries that are a little bit more developed and the rest that are a little bit underdeveloped. So in countries like China and Russia, where, COVID also hit quite as dramatically as it has here, they really haven't had to contend with the access problem, as Prof has quite well discussed in his presentation, to the extent that we've had to deal with it. So there you have your mobile coverage is good, your usage of digital tools is good. It's more normalized. Your students have actually grown up with these sorts of tools. And they know how to apply themselves when they're using the tools in learning. And so that's been very important. For us, I think then what you see there is in a country like Russia and China, they've then had more of a chance to grapple with the issues of quality, pedagogical quality, because the base is there. They have the opportunities for everyone to be able to participate in some form, and so they can figure out what quality actually means for them. In the developing world context, like what we see in the presentation and here across our countries, when we use technology, it's more of a novelty. We haven't quite figured out what's the optimal way for us to organize ourselves. We haven't figured out how do we convey content online? How do we work with the available resources that we have? I mean, we were talking about using WhatsApp as a means to communicate with students. And so we haven't really been able to figure out how do we grapple with these things? How do we communicate in a way that's actually exchanging information in a meaningful way? And so what we've seen here, I think on the continent more so, is not really quality online learning in any shape. It's more been about emergency remote teaching. So it's about a one-way provision of content, or provision or supply of information to learners. And then you're hoping that in some way they're going to be able to consume this, but then are we actually learning effectively? So to be able to get us on the same base, we really have to start dealing with the issues of access and then affordability, and then try to look at issues of skills. And then as Prof said, it's not just the skills amongst the students, it's the skills amongst the staff as well. We can't be assuming that we all have knowledge of how to work with these tools. It's something that you do have to learn, and you need continuous exposure to it to be able to know how to apply yourself. And so, I mean, it's also the added challenge that we have in our institutions is that we're also dealing with shrinking incomes. Many of our students had to leave their accommodation, and then there's been a loss of accommodation fees that the universities have been collecting. So you're dealing with that, and then trying to provide access to this type of infrastructure that's necessary, and it's quite a lot of costs which are going around. And so, how do you provide a quality educational output while you're still trying to deal with this? It feels, when we talk about emergency remote teaching, it feels like what we're doing is we're changing the wheels on the car while we're still driving. And it's quite a struggle. So for me, in a nutshell, I think we really need to try and figure out how we deal with issues of access first, and then we be able to get into discussions about quality.
Thank you very much, Chris. And I like we've linked what you see into the presentation that Stephen gave as well, because there's a lot he said in there that I suppose reflecting on all of the work we're doing and the lives we're living. And so Tristan, really interested to hear your point of view as well, and if you can sort of showcase or share with us whether the challenges we're seeing with access in Africa differ from what you see elsewhere.
Yeah, so thank you very much, Pauline. It's really great to see this event organized and to be in dialogue with Clara and Krish, as well as some of the empirical findings that we saw before. Yeah, I mean, I think when we think about equitable access, I think it's really important that we think about it in terms of two big areas. One is getting into the system, and then the second is what happens once you're in. A lot of the time, we're only thinking about the first of those questions. You know, a lot of the international data that we have is really just about who's in and who's out, just getting more bodies into the system, and then we don't really know much about what happens to them once they're in. And the two big things really, and both these are very relevant to COVID, are experiences, the process of learning, and people's well-being during that, what they're learning and so forth, very much affected by COVID. And then what happens afterwards? You know, how far they're able to convert that learning into other kinds of opportunities. And you know, the sad truth is that higher education systems around the world, while on the first of those things, getting people into the system, every higher education system is, you know, with some hiccups now and again, is going in the right direction. You know, the global access rates are increasing dramatically. They have done for decades, but almost no system has cracked the second one of those, which is about how you ensure equity once people are in the system. And I think, and it's those questions that have, you know, really been brought to the fore by COVID as well. You know, in relation to some of the points that Clara and Chris have already raised, the differing experiences for different groups. And you know, these difficulties within the system are, you know, partly to do with, you know, the two big ideas of availability and accessibility. You know, what systems are putting on offer, but also how easy it is for people to take up those opportunities. But also another idea, which I call horizontality, which is around how even how equitable the spread of different institutions is. So do you have a system where, sure, you know, non-traditional groups are getting into higher education, but they're having to study in institutions that are very poorly resourced, which don't have a recognized name. And so when they've got their degree, they're going out into the labor market and people are shaking their heads when they see, because they don't recognize, you know, they don't respect, you know, the name on the diploma. So, you know, horizontality is also really important, to have a system where there's even quality and prestige, not of course that all institutions are the same. But that's, you know, all institutions, even if they've got different missions, can actually have that level of quality and all of this matters. It matters for collectively for a country, of course, because you want to have all of your you know, all of the people who can benefit from higher education contribute to the country doing that. But really the most important justification is one of fairness. You know, our speaker before already mentioned the right to education. We do need to reassert this, and I was very pleased to see that this has been taken up at the international level at the UNESCO World Conference earlier on this year in Barcelona. UNESCO was strongly reaffirming this idea of the right to higher education. There have been a couple of reports published this year, and it's really good to see that even though, you know, higher education has been watered down quite a lot as a right over recent decades, that this is being reaffirmed. We need to think about this and re-engage with the idea. So that just some broad reflections to start us off. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Chris. Yeah, I'm pleased you raised the issue of the two sides to access, the getting in, and then also the quality of education you receive once you're in. And clearly, based on the presentations and based on the contributions so far from you, the panelists, it's clear that there were existing challenges before COVID, and possibly COVID has now amplified or made more visible some of these challenges. And it's right that we're looking at what the impact has been, and also how we can learn from those and try and find ways to adapt for the future. But I suppose from the presentation and what we've heard so far, there's no doubt that the online environment, the issues that we need to delve deeper into, and the use of technology, the haves and the have-nots, and the training and the capacity building. So I would like to hear from Clara first. So at the university level, given your role at the University of Cape Coast, what were the kinds of challenges or impact of COVID, especially thinking about the teaching and learning environment that maybe you can bring to life for us?
All right, thank you. So when COVID came, all the schools went down or closed down. However, with the universities, they started offering training for the staff so that we'll be able to develop some content and engage the students virtually. Now, the issue of when we reopened, we adopted the blended approach, that is in person, then with a virtual engagement. But with a virtual engagement, when the students do not find themselves on campus and they stay at their various locations, the issue of connectivity is there. So our situation actually shares much similar with the findings of Professor Adebero in the Kenyan situation. The issue of connectivity is there. The ability of the staff to even change to technology-based teaching happens to be an issue. We were given training all right, but you could see that even those who decided to do the virtual engagement, it was more of just presenting the content using slides. We were not engaging in the interactive forms. So staff actually had some challenges when engaging with the virtual forms. In the same way, students, to those who do not have a background in that, they were not offered any form of training. I guess it's because part of their training package is, we have ICT as part of their training package, all right. However, as to the access to facilities for them to train themselves prior to COVID is an issue. Then COVID came into the space and suddenly people had to rely on using technology. So having access to technology was quite, that's the target. It was quite challenging for some students. For staff, over here, we were given modems. And I know that most of the universities in Ghana also had this arrangement with telecommunication companies. So students were given modems and data, but their ability to even use it, I think it will need to conduct a study like that. But the general experiences shared by the students had to do with the difficulty of engaging virtually. When, for instance, you ask students to break into rooms, they do not know how to assess that. And beyond the training, no supports were also offered to help reinforce knowledge gained or the teaching that had been conducted. So generally, the story that we had here is not much different from what we find in the literature, nor within the Kenyan case. That's what I would say.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm sure there will be questions coming through when we get to that section from the audience. But Krish, I'd be interested to hear, given you are currently a student yourself, but also with your policy hat on, given you work in a policy-based research institute, can you also give us a view from your standpoint on what some of the challenges were, and especially given your interest in technology? This seems to be a recurring issue. Yeah, any thoughts from you?
Well, on the personal side, I don't think I've been as affected because I'm one of the lucky few that have the necessary technology that I've needed. So I've been able to engage with my colleagues quite directly. We're able to have meetings like this. I'm able to engage my lecturers online. So we've been performing at a suitable level so that the communication actually does proceed well. I think if I turn my attention to some of my studies that I've been working on, particularly looking at the BRICS, for example. I spoke a bit about the experiences in Russia and China. But if you focus on the experiences in India, Brazil, South Africa, we've been somewhat in a similar boat. We've all been grappling with issues of digital inequality. We've all tried to introduce some form of online education, and we struggle to some extent. In India, they have these massive institutions. The top 100 of them all tried to go online in some shape or form. And they had great difficulties. In fact, I don't think there was one institution in India that was able to successfully roll out online learning in 2020, at least. In Brazil, they were struggling with some of the crazy policies that were coming through from the Brazilian Bolsonaro government. And there, the government actually decided to try and cut funding to universities in the midst of the pandemic. And so they were having enormous problems trying to get resources to provide to their learners. And here in South Africa, we've had similar experiences in trying to figure out how to get all our students online. I think what you've noticed is that many of the students they benefited from bursaries and scholarships, and those bursaries or scholarships got them the foot in the door. It got them access to the institution, and the institution's facilities was the great equalizer. Once you entered those doors, you had access to the tools that you needed to be able to actually study well. And so you could then compete on par with someone from better circumstances, perhaps than your own. But with the pandemic, what you find is that instead of now getting access to these resources, you are pushed out of the institution back into your homes, where you then had to now contend with broken infrastructure, broken computers, busy home life schedules, dealing with cultural issues, all of those sorts of things, which then start to complicate how one actually engages with other students. And I think that's been the story. It's that it's exposed our inequalities to a much greater extent now, because we've had to go back home and then participate from our environments where we had our initial difficulties. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Christian. Actually, that would move me on to a question that either you or Tristan can respond, or both of you, depending on how you view it. I'm thinking now also about, you just mentioned exposing some of these inequalities even more, and that brings me to think about the marginalized or vulnerable groups, such as those who've come in or are studying in the rural areas, and as has been mentioned, may have had access to facilities when they're on campus, and now they've been sent home. Those maybe refugees living within our societies. Do you have any knowledge or through your research, any evidence of how these people may have been, again, disproportionately impacted by COVID, and what may have been done about it?
I think on the gender question, I think that comes up quite strongly in a country like India. You hear or you read about a lot of challenges where females, particularly from the rural areas, have been struggling to get access to the internet or computers. And so there's lots of taboos which go around in computers like that. Using the internet is a taboo. For example, if a young girl had to visit an internet cafe alone, this is now frowned upon, and people look at a stranger, and that's the view. What are you trying to do in this cafe? Are you looking for a husband? The young woman wants to use the phone. Why do you want to go on Facebook? Are you looking for a boyfriend? That's not the sort of thing that is done. Then in the same instance, you need the phone for studying, and then there's one phone in the household, and the father has to use that for his work, and then you get to play with it in the evening when I'm done. But in effect, you need to access your studies off that phone, and so it's that now is now balanced in that sort of household. So there's all of these different cultural taboos which are quite restrictive. And so the question then for us is, how do we design programs around that deal with that sort of thing? Also in India, what they have is that they've set up these information resource centers, which are then managed by women. And so that somewhat breaks down some of the taboos that you see, which are affecting women in particular. And so you're able to also try and run these programs at times which are more convenient for people that are working, that have to do chores in the household and that sort of thing. So yeah, in essence, what I'm saying is that we need to try and really design our learning programs around the realities that people find in their communities if we want that equitable participation.
Thank you, Tristan.
Thanks very much. So yeah, I mean, I think technology is really complex in relation to marginalized groups. I mean, I think it presents real opportunities, but also quite significant risks. I think we need to be aware of both of them. And I think the other speakers and the presentation have already highlighted difficulties both with provision and with uptake. So there are problems in how universities have actually put them as teaching online, and then difficulties people have to actually log into that and access it once it's provided. And we all know about dumping on Moodle. It's the easiest thing to do. You just put all the content there and let people get on with it. And I think this is a real problem. Online teaching is extremely difficult. It requires real skill and experience and thought, a tremendous amount of time to curate a learning environment that can provide a space for deliberation, critical reflection, interaction between people. It's extremely difficult. I mean, a face-to-face teaching is also difficult, of course, but we generally have a lot more experience of doing that, generated over years of, how do you curate a face-to-face classroom environment where people can put forward their views and listen to other, I mean, that's also difficult, but it's harder online. We're not so used to it. It takes a huge amount of time and experience to do that. And as has been said by various people beforehand, most universities in all parts of the world have failed in doing it. It's just been an information dump.
Yeah.
And this is actually worse for the students who are the most recent entrants into higher education from so-called non-traditional groups, because they are generally the students who have had the lowest quality primary and secondary education as well, and the least help from their family backgrounds in terms of financial resources and so forth. The better off you are, the better quality of schooling that you've had, the easier it is to navigate self-directed learning, because you've had all of the advantages earlier on to be able to critically analyze texts, to access different kinds of resources. So for those privileged people, self-directed learning online is possible. Doing MOOCs and so forth, and we can see from the development of MOOCs internationally that the vast majority of people who do MOOCs already have degrees. They already are people who can learn autonomously. It's much harder for people to do that if they haven't had that. So unfortunately, it's a vicious cycle. The more disadvantaged one is, the harder it is to actually access without that kind of support, and it's that support that's been taken away. Krish mentioned Brazil, and the tremendous difficulties over the last 4 years in terms of reduction of support to public institutions. But Brazil, even before that, had a tendency that I think is interesting to reflect on, which is gradual movement towards online private provision in higher education. So it's a country that has very liberalized higher education sector. For-profit companies are allowed to operate and have proliferated in recent years. So these are just companies, profit-making ventures. And in recent years, they've moved very heavily into the online market. So there was already quite a significant amount of purely online provision. But research that's been carried out has shown that systematically, even controlling for other factors, controlling for socioeconomic background and so forth, previous schooling, those people who are doing online degrees have worse outcomes, learn less, and have worse labor market outcomes often. So that's even controlling for other factors. So I think we have to be really cautious about this. Yes, it's a great way of providing access to people who can't physically come to an institution. And we have some great historical examples in my country. The Open University, which was the first experience of distance education at the higher education level here, was tremendous for people who couldn't go to the very traditional universities that existed at the time. So it's not that it isn't possible, it is possible. But if we are peddling a low-cost, low-thought model or a profit-making model, as we can see in Brazil now, which is really just about driving down costs and raking in profits, this is not going to serve disadvantaged populations at all. In fact, it's probably going to make things worse. Thanks.
Thanks, Tristan. It makes you wonder, I mean, especially with the move to online teaching and learning, for example, what provision was available for those living with disability, those who are, say, blind, for example. I fear to wonder how they would have coped with this situation. I mean, there's so much more that I think we need to learn from this experience and better prepare ourselves for whatever may happen in the future. But I have a question, Clara. I mean, it would be great if you could answer from your point of view, and after Clara responds, Christian and Tristan, you can contribute as well. But I'm thinking in terms of the response from governments, from universities, from investors or funders. We've heard from Professor Stephen as well about how parents were contributing to fees. Do you think there was enough support from these different stakeholders to enable teaching and learning to carry on, or are there other things that maybe should have been done with respect to funding, training, policies, from your point of view?
Okay, so from my point of view, the provisions were very inadequate because when you take the home level, for instance, how many homes have access to Wi-Fi? When students are in the house, how many of them are able to access ICT technologies? And as Tricia said, that when students are within the campus, the institution is an equalizer. So it is when they are all around that they are able to access the same facility. Now, with the facilities, with the study that I participated in, the study we had between Ghana and Felix Ofobuanye University, for instance, most of the faculty and the postgraduate students that we engaged in, they indicated that the facilities happen to be adequate. But the question becomes, what do they mean by adequate? That was an aspect we did not explore, because I would say something is adequate based on my knowledge of the terrain. So they indicated that it was adequate, but at the same time too, they highlighted their difficulty in assessing these technologies. So it's something that we really have to look into. As I said, we were doing more of the slides, but there are other areas that can be explored for the system. Like, for instance, using simulation, using gamification, so that it will be a way to help students at their own levels, because when students are able to access these technologies, it actually helps them. But currently, I cannot say that what we have in the system is adequate. And with COVID, the infections of COVID, that does seem not to have affected Africa as it was predicted. It does appear that we are gradually settling into the status quo, the period before the COVID. So we really must do more, because COVID has come to make us know that we can have a global sort of pandemic, and we can never predict what the future holds. So with adequacy, it was not adequate, and we must work on that.
Thank you, Clara. Any further contributions from Chris or Tristan on that topic?
I think I can share an example from China, perhaps, so just to contrast the experiences that perhaps we have here in on the continent. China benefits from central rule, so they're able to mobilize resources in all the different sectors of their economy in one sign of the pen, effectively from the head of the government. So when the lockdown became a reality early in February 2020 for them, China moved very quickly at that point to try and ensure that every teacher and lecturer in the country was enrolled in a crash course to build their skills necessary to work on online learning. And so there was a 1-week program that was instituted. I think that coincided with the week of the Chinese New Year. And they were then somewhat provided all the necessary types of skills to make them effective, at least at a basic level on that. And so they were able to very rapidly try and uplift skills across the board, across a huge country such as theirs. What they also did was that they mandated the educational technology sector to try and work together with the universities and the schools to produce new tools that then could be used. And so then these tools were then offered directly to these institutions, and then that was a new form of infrastructure that then became available. So they had that ability to try and work directly with their technology sector. And then one of the other interesting things that they did, particularly in the rural areas, is that they mandated every business to be able to open their doors and their Wi-Fi to any students that needed access to the internet. And so that then became the facilities that that students then had access to, so that they could try and gain connectivity. And so yeah, that's some of the benefits that you see in China, where you're able to try and mobilize all the different parts of the economy to work together to try and solve a problem. So we all don't follow the same sort of government, and we have different issues that we follow, but it's some of the ideas that might be beneficial for us.
Thank you, Chris. Tristan, any from you?
Yeah, so I mean, I was just linking this in with the some of the findings from Kenya that were really interesting to see as well. I mean, you know, the type of device figures were quite interesting. I think it said 60% access to smartphones and 35% only to either a laptop or a desktop. And I think those are interesting figures, particularly given that, of course, you know, you can do a huge amount on a smartphone, and all of us, I'm sure, use smartphones in work, but there are some things that are extremely difficult to do on a phone, and particularly for certain kinds of more active work, such as creating documents and, you know, long form writing, which is essential for academic success, extremely difficult on a. So I think we need to think about type of device. It's not just any kind of access. I think the type of device can also, you know, affect the kinds of work that you're able to do. I was also really interested to see the student views on how satisfied they were with their provision, and the kinds of access that they'd like. And you know, there's a clear preference amongst the students for face-to-face or blended learning. And I think this reflects students all around the world. Of course, there are some people who are very happy with purely online, but the vast majority of students prefer blended learning or face-to-face. And I think that's true of academic staff as well. I mean, you know, we've all had the experience of the changes in our work patterns. And I think a lot of them have been really good. And things, if we bring in the other element, which is sustainability, carbon footprint, so forth, you know, the reduction in the amount of travel that we're doing as academics is a good thing. But I'm sure we all recognize there are some things that are just very hard to do online. You know, building relationships, some kinds of discussion, and we do need, you know, some face-to-face interactions, even if we organize them in different ways. So I think both for academic staff and in research and planning and so forth, and for students, it's about how can we combine these things. You know, we're always going to have these digital online interactions from now on, but we also need to think about how we, you know, we blend these with the intensity, the physicality, the intimacy, the openness of face-to-face interactions, which need to be there in conjunction.
Thank you so much. I like the fact that we're not here to bash any particular stakeholder about their contribution. We're here to uncover what the real challenges were on the ground, but also have ideas for what may have worked well elsewhere, and to co-develop solutions to help us prepare for whatever comes next. And part of the plan for this webinar series is that for each one, we will prepare reports with recommendations that various stakeholders could use. So I'm really grateful that you're giving us practical examples and suggestions for how we can improve the situation. You've been doing a lot of talking, and I want to bring in the audience now as well to take their questions, their contributions to enrich the discussion. So we've started having some questions coming through, but to the audience, please feel free to send some more. We'll try and handle as many as we can. And also I'd like to invite Professor Stephen, if he's okay to put his camera on, so we can have all four of you contribute to the Q&A session. So yeah, Professor Bero, thank you for staying on with us and for joining the Q&A session now. I've already had a few questions come through, so I'll start off with one of these. And in some cases, I may direct it to a particular respondent, but if you have something else to contribute, please feel free to jump in and contribute. So one of the questions that has come from Dr. Bernard Okal, based at the School of Arts and Social Sciences. He's a lecturer at Maseno University in Kenya, and he's saying, what can we do to influence government policies to help in achieving equitable access to education in marginalized communities, so those without networks and other infrastructure for teaching and learning? What can we do to influence government policies? So I don't know who wants to start with this. Trish, is that one that you fancy?
Sure. I'm just thinking in the South African context about how government also responded to lockdown and what sort of assistance they provided the higher education sector at that point. The sad truth in South Africa is that most of the institutions were left to their own devices to try and figure it out, what they needed to do. And so you had every university then negotiating separate deals with your mobile network providers, your internet providers, to try and provide some sort of internet bundle, to try and get access to the resources that they needed. The state didn't try and centrally try and oversee those sorts of arrangements. And so I would have liked to have seen is that the government, whichever department it should have been, to try and negotiate on behalf of the higher education sector and get those data-free deals at zero rating that was necessary so that students could get access to the content. And so what you had in here is that certain institutions fared better than others because they were better at negotiating the deal. And so a University of Cape Town, for instance, was able to provide their students much more data than they needed. When you go to another university, they were only able to negotiate a deal where you could get data from midnight to 6 o'clock in the morning. And so you have now your whole student population starts getting these very awkward hours of when they can and can't study based on the data that they have. So I would have liked to have seen the government take a stronger role in trying to centralize those sorts of negotiations and come up with a single sort of arrangement that could have affected the sector.
Okay, thank you. Trish or Professor Bear, Stephen, any thoughts on the policy angle, governments and policy? Oh, Stephen, you're on mute.
Yes, I'm trying to unmute myself. Sorry, that looks a good question about what to do to influence government policies so as to establish infrastructure in marginalized areas. From my own thinking is that let's involve government from the word go. When we are doing surveys, when we are doing research, when we are trying to establish the situation as it is better for the government to be involved so that by the time the study is finalized, the government is part and parcel of it, and therefore the data speaks to government. speaks to it. A lot of times we go to government with statistics and data, but they do not appreciate what comes out of it because they don't know the processes that went through it. But if they are informed from the word go, and what you end up with becomes communally owned, it becomes owned by yourself and government as well. Another way is perhaps just making sure that the education budget is really protected. In some instances, the government is aware of the inadequacies in certain areas, like from our study, there seems to be some little information that is up, some small surveys where the government has involved and it's aware about certain inadequacies, like you're talking about infrastructure in marginalized areas. But I'm sorry to say this, in some instances, you find that the education budget is misused. Whereas the education budget, especially in Kenya, has taken the biggest share compared to other sectors of the economy, like healthcare, the roads, commerce and industry, and so forth and so on. But how much of this education budget actually gets to the marginalized areas? How much gets to where it's supposed to be? Very little gets where it's supposed to be. So if we have a bit of advocacy from the private sector, then the education sector is really protected so that it's able to do that which it's supposed to do. And if you know, all of us understand the budgeting processes. The budgeting process is supposed to involve everybody. When they put up the budget, say, for example, they publish the newspapers, this is how we are going to allocate this revenue. Let people be involved. Sometimes this is published, but rarely do people respond. So if people don't respond, you find a lot of this money going to per diems. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Prof. And also, I think, thank you for the contributions, I guess, from the point of view of the researchers and education budgets. And I think from the presentation you gave, I also really like the recommendation you made about looking at student finance as something that would be beneficial to students, especially those from marginalized groups who may be struggling, in terms of making the financial support more inclusive, more holistic, to cover not only feeding and accommodation, but the gadgets as well. Given what we've learned so far, I think that's a really useful recommendation as well, to think more about what an individual student needs to be able to contribute to effectively learn during their time in university, whether it's through blended or online teaching and learning. So I think that's one that could help students. Is there any other suggestion from Clara? Yeah, Clara, please.
Yes, so with the issue of government policy, when you relate it to funding, generally African governments seem to be overwhelmed when it comes to even funding the conventional in-person type of education that we are having. And with the virtual engagement, it's quite capital intensive. And it does appear because governments knew they wouldn't be able to afford if they are to pay for the technology. That's why they just permitted individual institutions to find a way out. But I think that government policy can come in the areas of collaboration. They can open up collaboration between institutions and the industries, for instance. They can look into the counterproductive policies that we have in the system that does not encourage private partnership with public institutions, for instance. They can come in to streamline these structures so that the public universities can benefit from these agencies. There are times, because government policy is not so clear when it comes to collaborating with the markets or the industry, So it does not encourage them to come forward. And sometimes, as my senior colleague indicated, even when monies are given, sometimes you do not know, it's difficult to check the wastage, check against the wastage in the system. So in as much as governments may find it difficult to fund the system, they can come in with policies to streamline the collaboration that we can have for the higher education sector.
Thank you very much. Preston, did you want to add anything? And then I'll come back to Prof.
I mean, I think in the UK context, you know, most of the policy attention to this was really around admissions and exams. This was the big talking point. I mean, it's quite a different kind of context, but the real debate and policy intervention was around how students might be affected in terms of their A-levels, and then the A-levels are used to select which students go to which universities. And a huge shift was made at the height of the pandemic, that, you know, the normal exams were cancelled, the national exams, and what were used were not exam results, but the predicted grades from teachers. So teachers generally provide predicted grades to students anyway, and they're used sort of tentatively on the basis of university applications, but then it depends on their actual grades whether they get into a university. In this case, they just used the predicted grades. But of course, that led to all sorts of uncertainty because, you know, the results were are always so much better in predicted grades than real grades, because teachers generally, you know, most teachers like to be kind to their students, and so it inflates the grades to a certain extent, and that also changes depending on the kinds of schools. So universities were then in a predicament that they had to let in more students than they would have done normally. So what you actually have is a strange dynamic. You've got a compression of students going, but you've also got an inflation in the number of students that are entering university, which then puts even more pressure on the universities in terms of their provision. So I think this was a well-meaning intervention from the government in terms of trying not to discriminate against some students who might not be able to perform well in their exams, but it also put even more pressure on the universities. So just one other thing that occurs to me that I think is important to bring into the debate. It's a difficult one for policy, but an important one for universities to think about, and that's mental health. Because of course, it's what we're talking about here in the pandemic and post is not just academic outcomes, but also people's personal and psychological and health outcomes, and the quite significant impact that the isolation from the pandemic had on students and others is also, I think, something to bring into the mix.
Thank you very much. Prof, did you want to contribute?
Yes,
briefly? Then I'll move on to another question.
The contribution by Clara just opened up my thinking to something else about public-private partnership. And it will be important to hear even what Krish and Tristan will be saying about this. Because truly what she says is true, that we need public-private partnership to support government in helping it to improve infrastructure in some of the marginalized areas. Truly, it's true that government is overwhelmed. But, you know, the support to government might as well start from within the very countries. Uganda, for example, does not expect that the private partners would come from elsewhere. The first ones must come from within Uganda itself. The question that comes to my mind is, to what extent has this government put in place policies that encourage the private sector to support them in education, even in laying of infrastructure in ICT and so forth, post-COVID. If you ask me, the answer is that the policies are not there that support the private individuals who want to come and support the very government. And what are some of the policies that we are thinking about? Some of the policies are through taxation. For example, if there are organizations that are registered and are willing to support infrastructure, are they taxed the same? There are these foundations like the Carnegie and Ford Foundations and others, wherever they are housed, is their taxation the same as the taxation of other organizations that are profit-making in nature? Assuming Kenya was to have some organizations that are for charity, organizations that support the poor, is there any policy that protects such organizations that support the poor? The answer is no. From the Kenyan perspective, is that if you have revenue and you want to support, you'll just be taxed as much as any other person. If there's an organization that wants to support charity, that wants to support the educational sector, it will just be taxed as much as any other organization. So for us to begin having a discussion and having sufficient revenue that will support even research, even infrastructure, even salaries, even teaching, and areas that are completely marginalized, so that people are encouraged to invest in charity, we must have proportional policies that say, if you're supporting charity, then your taxation should be lowered to a certain extent. I don't know what happens in developed areas, but my thinking is that that seems to be the way, and that's why you have so many organizations in developed areas being able to support charity. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Very interesting suggestions there. And actually, the mention of public-private partnerships by both Clara and yourself are in a way linked to another question that came through from one of the audience asking, how can we get universities to be able to be more self-reliant in terms of funding equitable access to universities rather than the current dependency on government? So that's African universities the question is referring to. So I think the public-private partnerships could be one way to look at generating more income or more resource for universities. But if others have other suggestions, please feel free to contribute in a minute. I just wanted to highlight, Prof. Stephen, there are quite a few questions in the chat section that are directed to your presentation, which has clearly generated a lot of interesting follow-ups. So if you could start having a look at those. And in the meantime, once I hear from the panel, if you have any other suggestions for universities to diversifying their funding, I will go to Yao in the audience. I see he's had his virtual hand up for quite a while. So yeah, I'll come to you in a second once we finish rounding up on the university funding thing. Thank you. Anyone want to respond or add more to the university's sustainable funding issue?
Could I make a quick comment on that?
Yes, please.
Yeah. So, I mean, you know, on the self-reliance thing, I think, you know, all universities have funds that come from somewhere. So there's no sort of internal kind of self-reliance, you know, magically funds a university. And you know, either the funds come from the state, or they come from the market, or they come from an endowment. You know, in very lucky, you know, universities, mainly the Ivy League universities in the US, and very few others, maybe with a very wealthy benefactor that have a cushion of funds that they can provide. So, you know, either you're making your money because you're charging students, or you're getting bits of money from the market in other ways, or you're getting it from the state, or you're getting it from the endowment. And all of those have their own strings. Probably the easiest one is to have a giant endowment, but very, very few universities have that. If you don't have that, you're either dependent on the government or you're dependent on the market. And neither of those is an easy thing. So I think, you know, it's a little bit more complicated than that. I think, you know, there are swings and roundabouts with both. And I think we need to think more about what the mission of institutions is, because, you know, just talking about the private sector as if it were one thing can be quite dangerous. And just coming back onto the public-private partnerships, you know, it's a really different thing. If we're talking about a for-profit company entering a public-private partnership or a philanthropic entity can be a very, very different thing. Our experience in the UK with PPPs has been very often that when they're made with for-profit companies, the company's made a profit and the state has endured all the risk and provided, the security there. So the public part of it has ended up losing out and the private part has ended up gaining. It's a very unfair relationship. But of course, there are other ways that the state can work with private entities when those entities are committed to the public good. I think this is the key point. We have to be really careful about what kinds of entities are we talking about. Are these private entities that are actually committed to educational quality, to the public good, or are they just looking to turn a quick buck? And I think it's a really important to separate out and not just assume that any kind of PPP is a good thing. I think it really matters what the partner is. And I think the previous Stephen's point about taxation and charitable giving is a really interesting one. And certainly improving the environment through which people can actually engage in socially committed donations and commitments of time is also a really important thing in order to ensure that those private entities can fulfill that public good mission.
Thanks, Chris. And should I just let people that there's some interesting comments and questions coming through in the Q&A section in the chat. So please have a look as well. And that's all feeding into the thinking at the moment. Krish, did you have anything to add before I go to Yao Oheneba Sechi?
The issue of the sustainability of the university is quite a complex question, and I guess there's no easy answer of how to redesign the institution so it reaches a point where you are able to increase access but also reduce your reliance on state funds. I guess we have to think carefully about the question of quality and how do we actually use technology in a way that we can, one, boost our coverage so that more students can get access. And in doing so, then if we're using the technology as the medium for teaching, what does that actually mean? Which programs can actually be done effectively on that, and how do you redesign those programs so that you are covering that sort of base? So you've got to almost look at it course by course to figure out what is possible, what can't be done through technology. But it's very, very complex. And I mean, we were talking about the institution being the equalizer. So could technology be the equalizer? That's what we're getting at. But if so, how do we redesign things so that we use the technology effectively? Definitely teaching over WhatsApp is not a solution.
Thank you. So lots to consider, and Tristan, I like the caveats you brought about as well, that we need to think more broadly about some of these suggestions and how to make sure that they are mutually beneficial and that the right people are involved in the thinking around some of these suggestions and before implementation. So thanks for that. Yao, if you are ready to ask your question, please feel free to do so. Tristan, Krista, can you please check that he's unmuted and able to speak?
Okay, just a second. Yao, can you hear us? I saw he unmuted and muted again. Yao, if you could just unmute yourself.
Yao, can you hear us?
Sort that out.
Hello.
Yeah.
Yes, can you hear me now?
Question. Yeah.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for all the contributions. My just small contribution and a comment. Yes, it's not necessarily all about technology, but what you use the technology for. And talking from my experience, and even specifically in the Ghanaian situation, we're trying to force our teaching and learning to model the 20th century way of teaching and learning, when actually we're about 22 years into the 21st century. And if we really prefer, as most people do, the face-to-face over the use of technologies. And we are trapped into this cycle of just thinking about examination, and then students finish out, and there isn't much content, there isn't much problem solving abilities that they have, there isn't much creativity, collaboration, or critical thinking. And so we need to re-examine, and this is not the first time we are saying this. We've been saying it, but we have not been implementing it. We need to re-examine how we teach and how we assess. And therefore, if our focus is still going to be on face-to-face, one person standing in front and all the students copying notes and coming back to reproduce the notes, it doesn't really help much. And that is part of what we need to be rethinking. So what I'm suggesting here is that both the governments and teachers and learners should have digital mindsets. And to have digital mindsets, it's not easy. It's a little complex, and it goes a long way. If the support is not there, if the infrastructure is not there, it's difficult to have a digital mindset. But in the end, if we are going to compete as Africans with the rest of the world, we need to seriously consider the digital mindset and move away from the monologue and the analog way of looking at things, so that we can assess students' learning from multiple points of view rather than just one examination, which leads us to nowhere. Thank you.
Thank you very much, y'all. Definitely touching on the quality of the teaching and learning. And I think we need another whole webinar to go into detail on that, but very, very valid point. So thank you for your contribution. I know we've been going for 30 minutes, but it seems there's still interest. There are questions we haven't answered yet. So Krista, if you're okay, I'll carry on for another 10 minutes and then we bring Lucy in. Okay, that's fine. So we have another hand up at the moment from Oladele, if he can be allowed to speak. Krista, is he open to speak? Oladele,
he should have access, yeah. Let me double check.
Please ask your question. Oladele, can you hear us? You have your hand up. Do you want to speak now?
Okay, he's up here now. Or she. Do you mind unmuting yourself, Oladele?
Otherwise,
if not, Pauline, you can move on to the other question.
Okay.
While we sort that out.
Alphonse has also got his hand up. Or I can move to a question in the chat if that's simple. Yeah. We're hoping to hear voices, make it more interactive.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Yes, please. We can hear you.
Good afternoon. For the source of income, so that they can put a certain percentage as compulsory to support universities, especially in this digital world that we are living, in order to enhance ICT technologies.
Sorry, who were you suggesting should put money in the pot?
To make it a policy, maybe on African Charter or on UNESCO that affects education international.
But who would be putting that money in? Who is setting the policy and who is investing?
If it, for example, at continental level, it can be set at Africa level. Each continent we have the same policy that will be applying internationally. So the government of the day should contribute now at 10% as per policy towards its local universities.
Thank you. A bold suggestion. I think even already some governments are struggling to meet their educational budget commitments, but certainly one to bear in mind and to propose in terms of the recommendations. How practical they can effect it will be a different challenge, but definitely worth considering. So thank you for the suggestion. Is Oladele now able to speak? Otherwise, I'll move on to a question in the chat.
Thank you.
Hello, Oladele, can you hear us? Okay, Pauline, I think you can move on to the questions in the chat.
Okay, thank you. Okay, the one on the mindset, I think Alfonso already picked up on that. Another question that came through was, okay, so someone was asking Professor Stephen that he would have been more interested to see what the level of satisfaction with online education was for the level of students. So you provided data on satisfaction for in-person, for online, for hybrid, and he's saying, okay, he wanted to see the level of study, like first year to fourth year. I don't know if you have any immediate response to that, if you collected data on that.
With a lot of honesty, we didn't collect that information. I've already responded to that question on the question and answer mode. But that would have been very important to find out whether the first years are more satisfied with online learning as compared to the third years or the fourth years, or whether the maturity of the student in the system contributes significantly to the level of satisfaction. As of now, my own thinking, just from what I observe, is that whereas there could be some small differences between the first years and the finalists in terms of their satisfaction with online teaching and learning, but given that there's no systematic, there's no plan to have these people properly taught on how to use maybe multi-platform or the other platform for teaching and learning, there could be some small differences between the freshers and the finalists, but those differences might not be very significant from my own perspective. But from the perspective of this study, we did not delve into trying to find out whether the more mature student, the more senior students, like the postgraduates, tend to be more satisfied with online teaching and learning as compared to the younger students. Thank you so much.
There was a related question as to whether the type of subject that students were studying also made a difference to the kind of responses they provided about their satisfaction. So for example, STEM versus non-STEM. So again, I don't know if you already responded to that or would like to say something.
I've also responded to that. Okay. I've responded to that. It looks a very good question. And I like the insightful questions that actually jog your mind into thinking more. You know, sometimes you think you have done so much, and yet there are certain questions that come and you're like, oh my goodness, how about thinking about this particular question? Like this particular one sent me thinking again and saying, perhaps the students who are doing, say those who are in ICT programs, those who are taking computers, or those who are taking, say, mathematics with ICT, whether they tend to be more satisfied with online teaching and learning by virtue of the extra course they take in ICT, and by virtue of the fact that they're more exposed to the ICT infrastructure as compared to the other students who are just doing, for example, BA, BEd, BSc, physics, or chemistry, and so forth. That looks really interesting. Although I must again admit that that kind of analysis was not appropriately done. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Given the time, and I think we've exhausted most of the questions that were coming through. So I'd like to give each of the panelists and our speaker a minute each to sort of give us their concluding remarks about the topic of interest here, and then we'll move on to the final part of the webinar. Thank you. I can start with Clara.
Okay, so thank you very much. So from the discussion we've had so far, obviously Africa finds itself in a very, should I say, suffocating situation, because we did not have control over the conventional system. Then suddenly we had this pandemic coming in, and we are being compelled to adopt technologies that seem not to be existing in most places in Africa. However, in as much as these technologies are not accessible in every area in Africa, one of the areas I would say we can look out to has to do with public places. That was something that Professor Adebero featured in his study. The public places like community libraries and parks, these are places that governments can actually set up so that when people are having challenges to access online facilities in their various homes, they could access these places. But if you take Ghana, for instance, parks seem to be vanishing. Almost every space is being bought by companies. You are finding libraries being closed down. We have a whole district that do not have libraries. So it's like students are able to access the libraries only when they are in school, but when they are home, what facilities are there to enable them to continue learning virtually? So this is an area I would recommend that our governments can look into.
Thank you so much, Clara. I'm just going according to my screen. Tristan, any final words?
I really like that point from Clara. I think the public places is a really important emphasis, and I also picked up on that in the findings from Kenya. How few people use cyber cafes or other collective spaces. But taking that together with Krish's earlier point about the barriers on individuals going to some collective places, whether it's discrimination against women and girls or other social norms, there might be various obstacles that people have in actually taking up these opportunities collectively around public places that we need to think about together with the actual, it's not enough just to set up a library or whatever it might be and have it sit there. You've also got to think about how do you actually ensure people can really get there and take up those opportunities. And just a broader point, really, the pandemic is a rupture, and like all ruptures, it provides opportunities and risks. And I think we need to be very discerning about which of the new things coming out of it we want and which we don't want. And not everything that's old is good or bad, and not everything that's new is necessarily good or necessarily bad. And I think we need to apply different criteria. Just because it's fresh and it looks exciting and it's digital, it doesn't mean that we should necessarily jump into it or embrace it with open arms. I think we need to think about how does this fit within our understanding of educational quality and social justice. Thanks very much. It's been really enjoyable, this debate.
Thank you so much, Tristan. Krish?
Thank you. Firstly, I'd just like to congratulate Professor Odebero for his detailed work that he's done in Kenya. It's great to see the amount of depth and the effort that he's put into it. And I think what the questions raise also, it tells us as deep as his study was, there's still so much more for us to do as researchers. There's still so much more ground that we need to cover. We need to try and unpack what is the optimal financing model. How do we ensure that we reimagine a sustainable university that improves access? How do we improve the learning model? What do we do to promote engagement so that we have more connection between our staff and students? So there's many unanswered questions that exist on the continent, perhaps. And so I would just urge us to stay connected, to be able to share knowledge. We're all working in our small spaces, but we're working towards a common goal. So I think it's very relevant that we keep connected and we find different ways of sharing knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Stephen?
Yes, thank you so much. Mills, Clara, thank you so much, Chris Cherry, Lucy, and everybody else who is on board. I think this study took us quite a lot. There's so much that we can share from the various objectives that we proposed and were able to collect data from. I want to say that the interaction with the panelists has been quite enriching. And even those who have asked the questions, it has been very, very enriching for us, and it will help us in further analysis. I want to suspect that there could even be some data that we can give some very, very different perspectives, and in situations where we find it was outside the scope, then there's interactions has made it possible for us to have a whole new understanding of the whole subject and to be able to even make recommendations for further research. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you all very much for contributing to this very interesting session in terms of presentation, but also the panel session and the Q&A session. I have enjoyed it and I've learned a lot by interacting with you, and thank you for your time. I will now hand over to Krista. Do you want to introduce Lucy? And then she can wrap things up for us. Thank you very much, everyone. Much appreciated.
Thank you too.
Thank you, Pauline. Thank you, everybody, for the engaging discussion. I'll hand over now to Dr. Lucy Hedy, who is the CEO of ESSA, as she gives the closing remarks. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Krista. And what an absolute pleasure for me. I think I have the nicest job in today's session to say thank you so much. First to Professor Odebero for giving the main presentation at the top, and to our panelists, Dr. Mills, Mr. Chetty, Professor McCowan, for such lively conversation full of great advice, both for higher education institutions and for policymakers. And I loved this combination of evidence from research, but also from first-hand experience. And I particularly enjoyed that mixing of learning between the African context and lessons from elsewhere. I think that really added richness to the conversation. Thank you, of course, to Dr. Pauline Essa for moderating the conversation. And then thank you to Dr. Mbengi and Dr. Nagimwa, and indeed the entire PASGR team for providing the PASGR Plus platform. It's such a valuable asset for the sector to have this space where we can discuss research alongside its practical implications. And finally, thank you to everyone who joined us here today for the really fantastic questions and for the great engagement. And I hope you'll be as excited as I am to hear that there will be more sessions coming up in 2023, more collaborative conversations hosted by ESSA and PASGR on the PASGR Plus platform. Thank you all very much and have a good afternoon or evening. See you next time.
Thank you too.
Thank you, Lucy. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you for staying on. I'm just waiting for, I think we have 1 or 2 more people to exit, and then we can have our.
I think that was excellent. Thank you so much. Pauline, you really facilitated a great panel and a lot of useful stuff coming out, because we still refining this work. So I believe we'll take up some of the points. Thank you, Tristan. Thank you so much for insights coming from where you sit. And our team, the rest of the team from ESSA, you've been wonderful.
Thank you.
And my colleagues, of course, my colleagues here at PASGR.
Yeah, thank you. I was asking people to stay on, really not just to say thank you to the panelists and the speaker as well. I think you all did a fantastic job, and we appreciate your time. We've taken more than 2 hours of your time today, but I hope you enjoyed it as well, and that the conversations were useful or will be useful for your own research as well going forward. And we hope you will come to other events. We have 4 more webinars planned focusing on our collaborative research from on COVID. And then once we exhaust the COVID thing, we'll look at other areas that are of interest to our stakeholders. So we'll invite you, and please feel free to share with us any material that you would like to share with our network as well. We're happy to help with promoting your research or books and stuff. And yeah, stay healthy. And thank you all to the team at PASGR and ESSA as well. I think we can be proud of what we achieved today and onwards and upwards. And thank you, Lucy, rounding up very nicely for us.
I mean, what a pleasure. I got to listen to this whole great conversation and just come in and say thank you. But what really struck me, because there are so many webinars out there, right? It's quite a crowded space. What really stood out for me was how much engagement there was between the panelists. And it really felt like a conversation rather than individuals just looking to get their message across. So, really thank you for engaging in that way as well.
Thank you all. You can have your day back. Thank you. All the best. Okay.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye,
Very
thanks.
much appreciated.
Bye.
So long.